In one of the previous sections, I discussed calcium, and really, I didn't really go into much detail about it. And I thought that perhaps, because I have such minimal space left on my memory card, and I thought really I might as well as really just redo calcium metabolism in a way that will make me feel better about it, instead of sticking to what I have before. Calcium really is one of those essential components. It's essential for the functioning of the body, for functioning of body systems, functioning of body systems. And when I say essential, really what I'm referring to is ionized calcium, which really is used for many intracellular processes, such as muscle contraction of obviously excitable cells, such as the cardiac cells, which I covered in cardiology. And when I covered and obviously skeletal muscles as well, when I covered muscle contraction itself, when I talked about the sliding filament, that obviously fits in there as well. Calcium is also useful as a secondary messenger for a lot of processes, including neurotransmission, transmission. Cannot spell for my life sometimes. And it's also useful for a lot of phosphorylation, like via the kinase enzyme processes. And it is also useful as a, so I've told about muscle contraction. What else? I'm forgetting. It also is then useful really for a lot of cellular processes. I'll just say, I'm sure they'll come back to me later on as I'm going through. It's just that I really want to cover this as quickly as I possibly can, because I haven't got much space on my memory card. And therefore, because of its usefulness really for virtually almost all biological processes in our body, calcium homeostasis is one of the most essential processes that occur in the body. So calcium concentration is kept at a normal homeostatic level. Usually it's kept at 10 milligrams per deciliter, or the normal is 2.5 millimoles per liter. And really that is the normal calcium concentration that when one undertakes clinical tests, biochemistry tests, that will be the normal that one would expect to find. And the calcium regulation has to be maintained, and it is absolutely required that it is regulated very, very closely, because it can readily cause a lot of activity. And it is a coenzyme. I think that's the one that I forgot. It is a coenzyme for a lot of body processes, and really it is kept mostly in the, I would say it's storage, the bone, where it's obviously kept as calcium phosphate. That's like bound to phosphate, and it's also really can keep like in the intracellular space where it's usually bound to protein, and like this is almost 99% really of all calcium. It's also kept in the extracellular space, and normally this is the calcium that we normally can measure. So this is measurable, and this is readily available calcium that can then enter the cytosol for use. So it remains in the extracellular space, well, extracellular fluid, and then it can then enter the cell and the cytosol for use. However, in the cell, intracellularly, it is kept in the ER, the endoplasmic reticulum, or in the SR for like cardiac cells, where it's the sarcoplasmic reticulum, simply because it acts very quickly, and its activity, once it enters the cytosol, is rapid, quickly, and causes rapid changes. For example, say we have I don't know, a receptor G7, a G7 coupled protein, a G protein coupled membrane sitting there on the which is obviously transmembrane receptor sitting there. Say once it gets bound, by anything really, whatever binds it, it could be adrenaline, and once phosphorylation occurs, calcium can then be can then activate kinases, and that activation of kinases, so calcium will activate a kinase, cause phosphorylation, and then that obvious phosphorylation can then also then lead to the release of calcium from the ER or the SR. So we call that a calcium dependent release of calcium. Again, that's more of a secondary step, but then its effects are quite rapid, and they cause massive cellular changes, such as perhaps muscle contraction, whereby when it binds to troponin C, I've recently covered this anyway, when it binds to troponin C, it then causes the entire troponin to change its conformation, and that changing of the conformation then causes tropomyosin to dislocate, and expose that myosin binding site, which then causes the actual generation of ATP, which then leads to muscle contraction. Therefore, the metabolism and homeostasis of calcium is kept really at a closely regulated process. So we do have most of the storage as bone, and then there is intracellular space, calcium in the intracellular space, which is mostly bind to protein, and then the extracellular space obviously is the one that can that can be readily available. So now that I've covered the storage, I would say perhaps absorption absorption of calcium is via the GI tract. I'll cover this when I do the gastroenterology lectures. So the absorption is in the GI tract, and I think it's via the small intestine, mainly in the duodenum, where there is active absorption. Obviously, when we talk of active, we mean that it's ATP dependent. And also in the jejunum and ileum, I think, ileum, where there is just passive absorption. And really, once it's absorbed, the absorption, really it's via the epithelial epithelial cells, which have a receptor that is called the, I think it's called the Cal binding. And Cal binding is a vitamin D dependent calcium binding receptor. And really what it does, what happens is Cal binding binds calcium, and then it sort of forms a vacuole, which then allows the calcium to come from the outside space, from the apical side, this apical side, to cross through to the basilar side, without really entering the cytosol, because obviously if it enters the cytosol, then it can cause a lot of cellular processes to occur, such as causing that action potential in excitable cells, because really it can affect the voltage changes of the sodium gate, of any voltage gated ion channels, and it can affect the activity of sodium, really, because if it enters, if it increased calcium, will cause the opening of those voltage gated ion channels, and then cause the influx of sodium, obviously, into the cell. And obviously the influx of sodium will then cause the sodium dependent current, and once the sodium dependent current is generated, then the cell can indeed reach a threshold and eventually fire, which really can lead to muscle contraction or whatever, and whatever the cell really is meant to do. And obviously the beta androgenic receptor pathway is still there, because I am yet to cover the all the receptors when I do pharmacology. But again, the calcium again is involved in the phosphorylation of the enzymes of the proteins that are involved in the whole process that is dependent to the beta androgenic receptors. So it's absorbed in the GI tract, and it can also be well, when I say absorbed in the GI tract, and then its regulation, instead of saying the absorption, like its regulation, as in its absorption and excretion, can be, like excretion, I'm just going to write E, can be in the kidney via urine formation, and excretion can also be, in the GI tract via, stools. And also there is the biliary. Obviously, this is sort of like part of the things that I'm doing right now, which is probably why I'm mentioning it. The biliary, dependent, which really is more like to do with the bile duct, where the bile duct will release calcium into the GI, and then it is then taken back to the bile, so it's more like it's sort of like a vicious cycle, or where it goes into the GI and then can be resorbed back into the bile, and then go back into the GI and resorb back into the bile. And then it can also be absorbed by the bone, and also released from the bone in a similar way to the bile. Not really in a similar, because bone is also like storage for the main storage for calcium. So the organs that are responsible in calcium homeostasis will be the kidneys, will be the GI tract, and indeed the musculoskeletal system, most especially the bone. So in terms of how calcium really is in terms of the regulation, it's via vitamin D, it's via the parathyroid hormone, and also the calcitonin. So the regulation is more of a hormonal regulation, and really it is via these three hormones. And vitamin D comes from the diet, which really provides vitamin D2, which is ecocalciferol, or it can be from the skin, sun, cholesterol, which then forms vitamin D3, which is the cholecalciferol. And then the parathyroid hormone obviously is, I think I'll do this separately. Say if we start with vitamin D. Okay. I know parathyroid is probably the most important, but then I'll just start with vitamin D because it's really there. So vitamin D can be from the diet or from the sun. And when I say from the sun, I mean that the UV rays from the sun, will convert cholesterol, so like a cholesterol derivative into a pre-vitamin D3, and then that pre-vitamin D3 will then undergo further hydrolysis, then undergoes further hydrolysis. But first of all, it has to isomerize after isomerizing. So once it isomerizes, so we have isomerized vit D3, it then is converted by 25 hydroxylase in the liver. This occurs in the liver, and then it becomes 25 hydroxycholecalciferol. And then this 25, 25, some people call it 25 hydroxyvit D. So I think it's still the same, whatever, I just learned this years ago and I've just been going with it. So this 25 will then is then further hydrolyzed. So the 25, I was trying to remember the equation, 25. Oh no, let's not do it out because I can't remember it properly. 25 hydroxy cholecalciferol will then be converted by 1. Is it alpha 1 or is it 1 alpha 1 hydroxylase? Oh gosh. or is it 1 alpha? Now I can't remember. Anyway, by alpha 1 hydroxylase in the kidneys under the influence of parathyroid hormone. So you need parathyroid hormone for this process to occur, which then converts it into the the metabolic active hormone, which is called calcitrol, or really alpha 125, alpha 125, is it calciferol. But anyway, so it's then converted into calcitrol, which really is the metabolic active hormone, metabolic active vitamin D3. And this calcitrol then functions as will then go into the GI. Remember, I mentioned that it's the absorption of calcium occurs in the GI, so then it will go into the GI and cause increased absorption of calcium and increased absorption of phosphates, because calcium and phosphate tend to go together, and then it will cause reduced loss of phosphate and calcium in the kidneys, and it will also go into the musculoskeletal system and cause the bones, the cells in the bones. It will also cause the osteocytes initially, as a rapid mechanism of increasing the availability of calcium. So it will cause osteocytes to release the calcium from readily available pools of calcium. Calcium pools. And really this is a short-term measure. And in the long term, it then activates the osteoblasts to secrete rank L, and then rank L then activates osteoclasts to then degrade bone and release calcium. So that is one way of regulating calcium. And obviously when there is low vitamin D, the opposite will occur. However, when there is low vitamin D, the opposite will occur. However, it's vitamin D3 is not the main regulator. The main regulator is parathyroid hormone. But anyway, this it's just that I really wanted to cover properly the conversion of vitamin, how vitamin D3 becomes the active hormone that then functions to regulate calcium, and where it actually works to increase calcium in the body. And then the next means by which calcium is regulated is via, which is really the main one, parathyroid hormone. And parathyroid hormone really is an 84 amino acid long polypeptide. Ooh, I can't even spell polypeptide that is released by the parathyroid glands, and the parathyroid glands are located posterior to the thyroid gland, which I covered in the respiratory system when I covered the larynx, and you know, it's just posterior. So there's the thyroid gland sitting there in the neck, and posteriorly, obviously this is not in any way, posteriorly we'll have 4 parathyroid glands there. So these parathyroid glands have chief cells which produce which produce parathyroid hormone. And parathyroid hormone really is secreted in response to, so really this is the most important, so it's secreted in response to low calcium levels, low calcium. So when there's low calcium, the calcium sensing cells will sense that there is low calcium and release parathyroid hormone. And once parathyroid hormone is released, it acts in, number 1, in the kidney, and it increases the reabsorption of calcium in the renal tubules, in tubules, and then in the kidneys as well. It actually increases the excretion of phosphates. And this is quite important because calcium readily binds phosphates. So calcium readily binds phosphates. And even in the bone, you know, it's found as it's found as calcium phosphate. I don't know, like 4, then it has a 2 minus there, which really obviously, and the calcium binds there, you know, this 2 then binds into that. So it readily binds phosphates. Therefore, the excretion of phosphate is important for increasing the extracellular amount of calcium. And then it also, parathyroid hormone will also increase the conversion of vitamin D3, you know, of pre-vit D3 to the functional calcitrol, which then goes into the GI and increase calcium absorption in the GI. The parathyroid hormone also stimulates osteoclast activity. Again, the stimulating of osteoclast activity really is better. I've always learned it via the rank, which is obviously a cytokine. And then once osteoclasts are activated, they then release calcium. So then we have a lot of calcium which is readily available. And then it also inhibits loss of calcium in the GI, in the stools basically. So so the parathyroid really will work in the kidneys. Also, you know, this is in the kidneys really, this conversion, the quick conversion of the hydroxylation of the pre-vitamin D to the active calcitrol. And then it will also act in the bone and indeed act in the GI tract to to stop the loss of calcium from the stools. So really, I would say these two act similarly. Their action is similarly, or shall we say in conjunction. So they act together to increase calcium when there is low calcium. So they act to increase calcium in hypocalcemia, which is sensed by the calcium sensing receptor cells. And then finally, calcitonin is quite different from the other two. Is also a hormone that is released in response to hypercalcemia. So this is increased calcium levels, hypercalcemia, and it's released from the C cells of the thyroid. So if you remember, this will be the parathyroid, and this is from the thyroid. So so the release of, it's actually quite a short peptide. I think it's 32, but don't quote me on that, because I think it's 32 amino acid, 32 or 34 amino acid, no, 32 amino acids long, I think, but don't quote me on that. And it's released because there is a lot of calcium, causes, number one, inhibits calcium absorption from the GI, but it increases phosphate absorption from the GI, and obviously, like, phosphate absorption will then bind calcium and then cause calcium to bind and be stored in the bone. So this is a really good mechanism of reducing calcium when there is hypercalcemia. And calcitonin can also be given therapeutically in emergencies, especially in cancer patients, perhaps when they have tumor lysis syndrome, which I've covered in when I was covering some of the hematology. So if someone has tumor lysis syndrome, they can be given calcitonin too. Well, obviously, if they have clinical signs of hypercalcemia, to reduce calcium, so that homeostasis can be maintained. Calcitonin also increases calcium, obviously, with phosphate deposition into the bone, and number 4, increases excretion in kidney and GI. So really, it's more of a, in hypercalcemia, it's mostly to really reduce the levels of calcium, whereas these two are mainly released or secreted or become functional in times of hypocalcemia.